Although many intellectuals did not believe in God, at least in a God who maintains the universe, it was not an official position. Darwin paved the way for the vocal disagreement with religion by outlining a scientific theory of evolution that directly challenged the biblical belief in a 6,000-year-old earth, and Nietzsche took it to a new level. In his book, The Gay Life, published in 1882, Nietzsche declared that God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred game shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of the deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? Hi. Today we're going to take a look at Friedrich Nietzsche and his famous, or most famous, accolade or contribution to the world of philosophy is his idea of the Ubermensch, which is seen as the Superman or superperson. It's bandied around a lot. It has been used and abused. But actually, if we delve deep into Nietzschean philosophy, we'll find that there is a lot that he has to offer in his concept of Ubermensch once you go beyond the usual platitudes. So let's get stuck in, take a look at Friedrich Nietzsche's The Übermensch. The Ubermensch, does it exist? What is it? And can we aspire to it? In the real world, is it possible to become the Ubermensch? The word Ubermensch is bandied around a lot these days. It has entered into the cultural milieu. Ubermensch is used to describe anyone who appears to be a genius. It's also used to describe an aspiration. Even take the popular rideshare company Uber. Uber is a pared-down version of Ubermensch. Ubermensch means overperson. Traditionally, it's been translated into English as Superman or Overman, but actually Mensch means person, so it's actually overperson or superperson. So if you get an Uber taxi, it's an over, better than the competition taxi share ride. If you go back a few decades to the early part of the century, Ubermensch was seen as representing a sort of superperson. The Nazis in Germany took hold of this concept and they used it as a way to progress their bigoted agenda. If you take a look at the world at the beginning of the 20th century, pretty much everyone was religious, or at least they would have to stay in line with general religious belief. Nietzschean philosophy could easily be twisted by political groups, such as the Nazis, for their own ends. They needed a counter-narrative to check the sentimentality of modern Christianity, and in Nietzsche's humanism, an anti-humanism in the traditional sense of rational humanism, as Nietzsche did not believe in an idealized perfect rational man or who would do the right thing according to his intellect, his rationality, which was the humanism of the 18th century. But he was a humanist in the sense that he did not believe in God. Rather, he believed in a human-centric world, albeit an imperfect one. God was replaced by man in the Nietzschean viewpoint. According to Nazis, it is a man who should rule the world, and man should be looked up to, but not any man. Rather, instead, only a special sort of man, an Ubermensch, an overman or superman, and the Aryan people were the only people with the right heritage to express this drive in the opinion of the Nazis. So what did Nietzsche really believe? Are any of these philosophies in tandem with the original beliefs of Nietzsche? Or was Nietzsche really pointing to a different direction? And of course, can we gain anything out of it? Can we become an Ubermensch of sorts? Is it even worthy of consideration? So let's jump in and see what Nietzsche actually means by the term Ubermensch. Biography. Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900, was a German philosopher, essayist, and cultural critic. His writings on truth, morality, language, aesthetics, cultural theory, history, nihilism, power, consciousness, and the meaning of existence have influenced Western philosophy and intellectual history. Nietzsche began his career as a philologist and retired from active academic life in 1879 to devote himself to writing philosophical works. He is most famous for his phrase, "God is dead." Nietzsche challenged the foundations of Christianity and traditional morality. He was interested in the enhancement of the individual and cultural mores. Sadly, Nietzsche had a mental breakdown when he was 44. He never recovered and he died 11 years later. The 19th century was a period of great change in the understanding of what it was to be a human being. With Charles Darwin and his book published in 1859, The Origin of the Species, this represented a turning point in explicit understanding of what it is to be a human being, for it declared quite publicly that man was not governed by any existential God, but rather as an outcome of evolution. Although many intellectuals did not believe in God, at least in a God who maintains the universe, it was not an official position. Darwin paved the way for the vocal disagreement with religion by outlining a scientific theory of evolution that directly challenged the biblical belief in a 6,000-year-old earth, and Nietzsche took it to a new level. In his book, The Gay Life, published in 1882, Nietzsche declared that God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of the deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? Nietzsche Gay Science, section 1 to 5. What Nietzsche declared here is not the death of God, but rather the death of a world ordained by religious sentiment. In a post-religious world, a world where mankind no longer had to have a priest as a mediator between man and God, would indeed require a new man who would stand tall and take charge of his own destiny. Nietzsche's concept of the Ubermensch, the overperson, is a new man, a new person, an evolution of mankind such that this new person will take his or her place in the great order of things by standing tall and straight and replacing the need for religion with that of this new, powerful human being. But is this Ubermensch a reality? And if so, what exactly is it? According to Nietzsche, the Ubermensch possessed 7 traits which defined him, and they are 1. Individualism, 2. Will to power, 3. Transcendence of good and evil, 4. Eternal recurrence, 5. Affirmation of life, 6. Creativity, and 7. Self-expression. Starting with individualism, the Ubermensch is Starting with individualism, the Ubermensch is first and foremost a free person, because they would no longer be held in check by any cultural norms. Nietzsche believed in fatty love, the love of fate, the belief that what happens is meant to be and is basically good for us. We should not feel down about our circumstances, nor should we feel as if we are victims. Rather, the Ubermensch should become a creator in their own life. They should assess the reality of their life and do their best to shape their destiny while accepting that everything may not go the way that they want to go. He believed that this rugged individualism was not for the majority of human beings on this planet who have a herd-like mentality. The Ubermensch is willing to stand out tall and be a contrarian and not worry about the consequences of his or her actions. So very importantly, although he believed in the concept of an Ubermensch, he did not believe that most people will be able to attain it. 2. Will to power. The higher philosophical man has solitude not because he wishes to be alone, but because he is something that finds no equals. Friedrich Nietzsche, The Will to Power. Nietzsche believed that this rugged individualism was an extension of the will to power. What is the will to power? It is the effort to self-determine one's life and to deign one's destiny. Here are some key aspects of Nietzsche's concept of the will to power. 1. Basic nature of reality. Nietzsche believed that the fundamental driving force in the world, including the natural and human worlds, is the will to power. He suggested that everything in existence, from physical phenomena to living organisms, is characterized by constant striving for power and expansion of one's influence. 2. Human nature. Nietzsche applied the concept of the will to power to human beings, asserting that it is a fundamental aspect of human nature. He argued that individuals are motivated by a desire for power, whether it be in the form of social status, influence, or control over their own lives. This inherent drive influences human actions, ambitions, and even moral values. Morality. Nietzsche criticized traditional morality, particularly the Judeo-Christian values, as inhibiting the natural expression of the will to power. He argued that moral systems that suppress or condemn the desire for power lead to the weakening of individuals in society. In his view, conventional morality often promotes a slave morality that devalues strength, ambition, and assertiveness. In the early years of the 20th century, we would see the rise of Aleister Crowley in England, who helped push forward the occult movement, and his dictum was, "Do as thou wilt, be the whole of the law." So I think maybe Crowley and other occultists, or we should call them Crowleys, actually the right pronunciation, Aleister Crowley and other occultists in the early 20th century were very much following that breaking the Victorian norms and trying to be something different. And maybe they got this idea from Nietzsche, and definitely Nietzsche here is challenging the norms. Number 4, overcoming obstacles. Nietzsche saw that the will to power as a force that drives individuals to overcome challenges, obstacles, and limitations. He believed that the pursuit of power involves a constant striving to enhance oneself, push boundaries, and assert one's individuality. Adversity, according to Nietzsche, is an essential aspect of personal growth and the realization of the will to power. So very much that which does not kill you makes you stronger, that kind of mentality. 5, eternal recurrence. Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence is closely tied to the will to power. He asks his readers to imagine living their lives over and over again for eternity. If we could affirm and embrace every aspect of their existence, including the suffering and the challenges, then they've truly embraced the will to power. Very interesting concept. Basically, in other words, if your values that you live by, that are part of who you are, if you can live according to those values, let's say in congruence to those values, even though it might be tough, you're going to be happy, which is basically the idea of having a mission in life. And I think one of the reasons why people strive a lot in life is because they find themselves doing things in careers and jobs and lives that don't match who they really are as a person. So I think that's what he's talking about in the eternal recurrence, is that if you had to do it again, would you be happy that you did it, basically. Aesthetic experiences can momentarily satiate a will to power. Aesthetic experiences can momentarily saturate our will to power. So what he's basically saying is we're always going to be striving for more power, which can be power over people or also empowerment. But the aesthetics can tap into that and help us express and give us relief, momentarily relief when we're in aesthetic states. So he says here we have expression of power. The act of creating art is an assertion of individuality, a demonstration of one's unique perspective and creative force. Art for Nietzsche is a powerful mode of expression. Artists, through their creative endeavours, channel and manifest their will to power. Transcendence of everyday existence. Aesthetic experiences can transport individuals beyond the mundane aspects of daily life. When engaged in a beautiful piece of art or sublime natural setting, individuals may experience a sense of transcendence. The temporary escape from the ordinary can be seen as a momentary triumph of the will to power over the challenge of existence. Intensification of life. Nietzsche believed that aesthetic experiences have the power to intensify the experience of life. Beauty in its various forms has the potential to evoke strong emotions and a heightened sense of being alive. This intensity is closely connected to the will to power, pursuit of self-affirming, and enhancement of life. Individual interpretation. Aesthetic experiences are highly subjective and depend on individual interpretation. Nietzsche's emphasis on the individual's unique will to power aligns with the idea that different individuals may find affirmation and satisfaction in different forms of art or beauty. So the outer form might be different, but one way or another, it's channeling that will to power in a very healthy way. So we could really say about sublimation. So our society, if you look at, say, from example, the idea of Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis, our society tends to be repressed. How do we have a healthy expression? And so art and also spirituality and aesthetic experience in general are basically ways of sublimating those drives in a healthy way. Okay. While aesthetic experiences can offer a temporary satiation of the will to power, Nietzsche also recognized that such moments are fleeting. The eternal recurrence, another key concept of his philosophy, suggests that individuals must continually seek and create new experiences to affirm life and to will to power, which is again an interesting concept, that we really have no choice but to continue to find new pet projects, to find new things to focus on. There's no stage that, like the movies, we have the happy ending where the boy and the girl ride off the sunset. In reality, we have to find new goals, new mountains to climb, new hills to conquer, as it were. Friedrich Nietzsche's exploration of the transcendence of good and evil is a central theme in his philosophical work, particularly his book Beyond Good and Evil. Nietzsche was critical of traditional moral systems and sought to question and move beyond conventional notions of morality. Here are some key aspects of Nietzsche's perspective on the transcendence of good and evil. Critique of morality. Nietzsche was a sharp critic of traditional morality, particularly as expressed in religious and philosophical systems. He argued that morality, as commonly understood, was often based on arbitrary values imposed by society or religious institutions. He believed that these moral frameworks limited creativity and self-expression. Now, of course, when he came out of these concepts, the latter half of the 19th century, he shocked a lot of people. But when you think about it logically, he was just taking the common sense approach of thinking for himself about why is it that we are the way we are? Why do we have the rules that we do? So much of it is arbitrary. And I think it's an interesting experiences that he had, but also that it represents a certain maturation in humanity that people like Nietzsche start coming along, and other people as well, who start thinking and questioning, which is actually a good thing. Perspectivism. Nietzsche introduced the concept of perspectivism, suggesting that truth and morality are not objective or universal, but are influenced by one's perspective and interpretation. He argued that there are multiple perspectives and individuals should embrace a more subjective understanding of truth and morality. If we cast our mind back to the late 19th century, most people would have been raised, or most educated people, in the Greco-philosophical ideas of Plato and Aristotle. Plato particularly had this analogy of the cave of shadows, that the human being is like a person who is stuck in a cave and he can't see the real world. He can just see the shadows on the cave wall, and so he's trying to find his way. But out there, somewhere outside the cave, in the world of forms, are perfect form. So there is perfect beauty. So the Greek idea would be that there is a perfect concept of beauty. Now, Nietzsche is directly contradicting this and saying, no, beauty is really, there is no absolute beauty, it's objective. Now, of course, we could now look at, in this stage, and look back and say that maybe on a philosophical level, one could say that there is an absolute beauty or an absolute truth, purely from a conceptual point of view. But in our daily living, yes, Nietzsche has a point. In our daily living, what is beautiful and what is true is largely subjective. And perspectivism gives an opportunity for us to think in a way that goes beyond rules. Now, you have to remember that when Nietzsche was in the late Victorian era, so it's all rules and regulations. So he really is in many ways revolting against that. Master-slave morality. Nietzsche distinguished between master-slave morality and slave morality. Master morality is associated with values such as strength, power and ability, while slave morality is characterized with values like humility, meekness, and compassion. Nietzsche criticized the dominance of slave morality, which he saw as a reaction to the dominance of master morality. And he saw the transcendence beyond this dichotomy. We have to go beyond being the master and the slave, between the dominator and the dominated. Will to power. Here we go again. Nietzsche proposed the idea of the will to power as a fundamental driving force in human nature. This will to power involves the desire for self-affirmation, growth, and the assertion of one's individuality. Transcending traditional notions of good and evil involves embracing this will to power and moving beyond restrictive moral codes. Overcoming dichotomies. Nietzsche encouraged the individuals to overcome dualistic thinking, including the dichotomy of good and evil. He believed that transcendence of these binary distinctions would lead to a more liberated and creative existence. This involves recognizing and accepting the complexity of human nature and morality. Now, this belief of overcoming dichotomies is extremely popular today in the early part of the 21st century, but back in the 19th century, this was really quite outlandish thinking by the standard of those times. Creation of values. Nietzsche proposed the idea of the overperson or Ubermensch, an individual who transcends conventional morality and creates their own values. This involves the ability to critically evaluate existing values, discard those that are limiting, and creating new ones that align with the individual's will to power. So, the Nazis really took on the whole Nietzschean ideal of a Ubermensch, a Superman, but theirs was a twisted vision because they wanted people who would simply buy into their system of thought. They didn't want people who were capable of creativity. They didn't want people who were capable of thinking about their life and creating their values. So we must really differentiate Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch from many of the later interpretations. The original idea that Nietzsche has of the Übermensch is somebody who is a free agent, who is not limited by the mores of the day, and who is capable of evaluating their life and coming up with their own values because they are a thinking, creative person who has agency. So very radically different from this idea of simply some ideal person who fits in with a certain status or way of thinking about life that's simply thrown at them. He's not looking at indoctrination. He's looking at a mature human being. In summary, Nietzsche's exploration of the transcendence of good and evil involves challenging traditional moral frameworks, embracing perspectivism, and advocating for the individual's creative power to overcome limiting dichotomies and create their own values. For Nietzsche, the individual is God and must find their place in the pantheons of the God. Rather than worshipping an external deity, man should worship his own specialness as a conscious being in the universe. Here we see a modernist theme emerging of the human being as an agent of change within the world. And there's no need for the glorification of any external deity, and instead the human being must become the focus of our own higher aspirations. 20th century humanism has largely been created out of this concept of a world that is not run by God, but a world that is created by human beings. Nietzsche's concept of the eternal recurrence is a thought experiment and a philosophical idea presented in his work, The Spoke Zarathustra. It involves the notion that our lives and experiences are eternally recurring in an infinite cycle. Key aspects of Nietzsche's eternal recurrence include the thought experiment. Nietzsche asked readers to imagine living their lives over and over again, exactly as they have lived them, with every detail and nuance repeating infinitely. He presents this as a challenging, profound thought experiment meant to provoke reflection on the value and meaning of one's life. Embracing existence. Nietzsche suggests that one should live their life in such a way that if faced with the prospect of eternal recurrence, they would embrace it willingly. This implies living a life that is genuine, authentic, and in accordance with one's values and desires. It challenges individuals to consider whether they are living in a way that they would want to experience repeatedly. Affirmation of life. The concept of eternal recurrence is closely linked to Nietzsche's broader philosophy of life affirmation. He encourages individuals to affirm and embrace life, including its joys and sorrows, successes and failures, rather than seeking to escape or deny aspects of existence. Overcoming resentment. Nietzsche believed that the acceptance of eternal recurrence would help individuals overcome feelings of resentment and regret. If one truly accepts and affirms their life, including its challenges, they may develop a more profound sense of contentment and resilience. Creation of values. The idea of eternal recurrence is also connected to Nietzsche's emphasis on the individual's role in creating their values. If one's life is to be repeated infinitely, the values chosen and created by the individual become crucial. This involves a process of self-overcoming, where individuals continually strive to improve and refine their values. And once again, very radically different than more modernist ideas of an Ubermensch or overman or overperson who's simply some super strong person or super powerful person. No, it's about a mature person becoming more and more mature, more and more self-aware, and developing more and more agency over time. Affirmation of life and creativity. Nietzsche's affirmation of life and creativity is a central theme in his philosophy. This concept is closely tied to the rejection of traditional moral values, his embrace of individualism, and the celebration of human capacity for self-overcoming. Here are the key aspects of Nietzsche's ideas in the affirmation of life and creativity. Life affirmation, amor fati. Nietzsche urged individuals to affirm life in its entirety, including both its positive and negative aspects. This affirmation, encapsulated in the Latin phrase amor fati, love of fate, means embracing one's own life and destiny without resentment or rejection. Rather than viewing hardships or challenges as obstacles to be avoided, Nietzsche encouraged individuals to see them as opportunities for growth and self-realization. Will to power. The affirmation of life is closely connected to Nietzsche's concept of the will to power. This is the fundamental driving force within the individual to assert themselves, overcome obstacles, and strive for self-realization. Embracing the will to power involves recognizing and nurturing one's inner desires, strengths, and creative instincts. Creativity as self-expression. Nietzsche saw creativity as a key aspect of the affirmation of life. Through acts of creation, whether in art, philosophy, or any other form, individuals express their unique perspectives and contribute to the ongoing process of self-overcoming. Creative endeavors allow individuals to transcend conventional limitations and contribute to the ongoing evolution of culture and society. So very much, again, a revolt against the rule-based living of the Victorian era. And we're looking again at the idea of the Ubermensch as being some mature person who's capable of reflecting on their life and who is a creative kind of person who has their own flair based upon their own value system. Overcoming nihilism. Nietzsche was critical of nihilism, the belief that life lacks inherent meaning or value. He believed that the affirmation of life and creativity offered a path beyond nihilism. By actively creating meaning through individual and collective endeavors, people could overcome the sense of purposelessness associated with nihilistic perspectives. I think there's something worth considering. People tend to think that, Nietzsche was like, throw all the rules out and just go for it. And it's interesting that once you take religion out of the mix, you tend to have nihilism. But the problem with nihilism is it leads to a life where people try to satisfy themselves through external sensory pleasures. They try and have experiences which they enjoy, but because they have no belief in anything bigger or better or nothing to work for, because everything's kind of meaningless, the external hedonistic lifestyle doesn't seem to give them what they want. They seem to have an emptiness within. And if we watch our cultural milieu that we're living in today in the early part of the 21st century, so many books and TV shows and movies and people in general are very nihilistic in their viewpoint, and it's not life affirming. So understand this, that although Nietzsche he did not believe in swallowing a textbook, he did not believe in following a rule book and living a life based in a bunch of arbitrary rules that's thrown at you as a kid, nor should you believe in an external God. But just because he didn't believe in an external God doesn't mean that he didn't have hope or aspiration. He really did believe in life affirming and having goals and working towards things and having values, rather than nihilism, which is simply a kind of a desperate absence of having any kind of values or beliefs in anything. And of course, that lack of hope kills people, because there's an old saying that says that hope is the mother of mankind, and it's certainly true. So I think it's very important we realize that Nietzsche's idea of the Ubermensch is somebody who is not a nihilist, somebody that very much is a humanist in the sense of not the 18th century kind of, he who is rational will do the right thing. No, a human being who is mature and reflective and has a value system. So interesting when you think about it. Eternal recurrence, as we discussed earlier, the concept of eternal recurrence is discussed earlier. Part of Nietzsche's affirmation of life, by imagining living one's life over and over again, individuals are challenged to consider whether they are living in a way that they would willingly repeat. This thought experiment encourages deeper reflection on the choice one makes and the value one holds. Individualism and self-overcoming. Nietzsche celebrated individualism as the idea of the overman or overperson, Ubermensch, an individual who transcends societal norms and creates their own values. In other words, a mature human being. This involves a continuous process of self-overcoming, becoming a better version of yourself over time. Striving to become the best version of yourself through conscious self-reflection, personal growth, and the pursuit of one's unique potential. In summary, Nietzsche's affirmation of life and creativity is a call to embrace the fullness of human existence, recognizing the inherent value of life and the creative potential within each individual. It involves actively shaping one's destiny, overcoming challenges, and contributing to the ongoing evolution of culture and consciousness. The critique of the Ubermensch. Nietzsche's concept of the Ubermensch, often translates as the overperson or superman, has been influential and thought-provoking. It is not without its critics. Here are some common criticisms of Nietzsche's Übermensch. Elitism and exclusivity. One of the main criticisms of the Ubermensch concept is that it can be interpreted as elitist and exclusive. The idea of a superior individual who transcends societal norms and creates their own values might be seen as fostering a sense of superiority over others. Critics argue that this could potentially lead to social divisions and lack of concern for the well-being of those deemed inferior. And of course, in some of the interpretations, such as the Nazi interpretation of Nietzsche's work, this would certainly be true. And it's something that we have to watch out for, because Nietzsche is coming from a very high place of a perfected human being, a very good human being, but what happens in reality, and this is always an issue, is yes, you might have an ideal, but what's going to work in everyday reality? Can the ordinary person deal with it? And some very good concepts can be twisted by malicious people. Subjectivity and lack of objective criteria. Nietzsche's concept of the Ubermensch is highly subjective, as individuals are encouraged to create their own value-based system on their unique perspectives and circumstances. Critics argue that the absence of objective criteria for determining what constitutes a higher or more advanced individual makes the concept difficult to apply universally. Again, we have to remember that he was around the late 19th century, and in a world that was very orderly. I do believe when we look today, we see all sorts of interesting things. For example, euthanasia has been talked about a lot these days. Is it right? Is it wrong? So we see a lot of the, what's true for one person is radically not true for another, yet these things have an effect on society. So, yes, his kind of presumption is that the Ubermensch will do the right thing in having their values. But there is a very moral grey kind of ground in what people think they should or should not do. Critics argue that the concept of Ubermensch is particularly susceptible to misinterpretation, potentially leading to the justification of authoritarian or narcissistic behaviours by those who claim to embody the Ubermensch ideal. And of course, we've seen that with the Nazis. And also just an issue that we see in Nietzsche's writing is he's very vague and things can be interpreted in many different ways. And, he might have been coming from a very high place, but a lot of people reading it might not. I mentioned earlier that in the early to mid part of the 20th century, Aleister Crowley will become very popular. He was an occultist living in the UK with his dictum, "Do as thou wilt be the whole of the law." And obviously, Nietzsche was not seeing that in the late 19th century, but in the 20th century we saw a lot of people, the modern occultists, who basically come out and say that everything is arbitrary and that you have the right to will, to power, and to do what you want. And if you want what you want more than somebody else wants, then you have a right to it, and so on. So, yes, there is this problem with egotism of if somebody's more dominating, should we just let them dominate? I think there are a lot of ethical questions which you can ask practically. I do see that people like these occultists are trying to, live a real life, and that they focus on the empowerment of the individual. But again, in society, we have to think about what's good for everybody, that everybody doesn't have the mental capacity or the moral goodness to do the right thing, to just look at a situation and do the right thing. But again, of course, Nietzsche wouldn't have known that back in the late 19th century. So like all philosophers, I feel that Nietzsche is a bit of a, dreamer, idealist. The undefined nature of the Ubermensch is another issue. Nietzsche's writings often involve metaphorical and symbolic language, and the concepts of the Ubermensch is no exception. Critics suggest that the ambiguity surrounding the nature of the Ubermensch makes it difficult to pin down precisely what Nietzsche intended. There is a potential for misinterpretation. Nietzsche's work has been susceptible to misinterpretation. Some argue that the Ubermensch concepts have been co-opted or distorted by individuals' ideologies that Nietzsche may not have supported. Lack of practical guidance. Critics contend that Nietzsche's philosophy, including the Ubermensch, doesn't provide concrete guidance for individuals seeking to navigate the complexity of real-world moral dilemmas. So, in other words, it says that you should be like this, but it doesn't say how. And that's always the issue. Anybody can say what something should ideally be. But what about the how? How do you get there? Okay. The Ubermensch in context. Does it exist? And is it worthwhile acquiring it? We have to put Nietzsche and his concept of Ubermensch into context. If we are to have any hope of understanding and working out the implications of his philosophy, Nietzsche was a man of his time. He was born and raised in a Christian-centric, rational, idealistic world. A world where people were either Christian, or at least they paid lip service to Christianity, or the implicit idealism of Christianity. Even people who were not Christians, or who professed themselves to be atheists, were still all the same time rational idealists, and that they were inspired by the Enlightenment, which emphasized reason over and above religion and superstition, and emphasized the reasonableness of man, that mankind would naturally do the right thing, and that there was an inherent tendency towards civilizing the world. Against this backdrop, Nietzsche was a contrarian figure who was open enough Against this backdrop, Nietzsche was a contrarian figure who was open enough to notice that not only did the religious superstitions of people not make sense, but also the rational idealism of well-educated people did not stand the test of reality. It is indeed a paradox, or maybe perhaps a sad turn of fate, that Nietzsche would possess the level of reality-checking awareness to realize that something was rotten in the state of Denmark, to quote Shakespeare, and yet he himself would suffer from mental ill health from his middle years onwards, thus reducing his capacity for reality-checking as his mental health took hold of him. A man who rose to prominence because of his unique mental contributions to the intellect and understanding of humanity would himself become undone by his own mind, as his mind degenerated into a state of mental illness. Consequently, we only have an early and mid-phase Nietzsche. It would have been interesting to see if his mind had stayed intact, what an old age Nietzsche would have brought to the table. Anyway, he could see the wood for the trees, and he was intellectually honest enough to pronounce his findings, and he was also a suave and sophisticated communicator who could create a message which was metaphorical in character. The advantage of a style of writing which is metaphorical in character is that metaphor opens the way for multiple interpretations that can all be mutually true at one and the same time, and furthermore paves the way for interpretations that the author of such a work himself might not have been aware of. So we have to review the philosophy of Nietzsche in the sense that he was reacting to a world which liked to predetermine outcomes and wanted to force people into religious subservience on the one side or humanistic, rational subservience on the other. In the present strongly nihilistic society today, we can easily agree with Nietzsche about how the world is not an ideal place and how we have to overcome ourselves. But way back in the 1870s, such thinking was simply not just contrary, rather was revolutionary in character. The point we have to realize here when we ponder the various interpretations of Nietzsche's work is that their interpretations are not necessarily what Nietzsche himself taught. Sadly, Nietzsche would suffer mental health issues from his mid-40s until his death at age 55. So sadly, he was not in a mentally fit state to reflect upon and develop his theories further. Ultimately, the many interpretations regarding the philosophy are actually reflections upon a series of ideas whose ownership is really global because they're reflections upon ideas put out there by Nietzsche, but never defined by him. Some philosophers go to great pains to define their philosophy, but Nietzsche was not one of these. The advantage of a metaphorical approach to philosophy are its endless interpretations, but also can be a hindrance over time, and especially after the death of a philosopher, because his ideas can be taken over and rewritten by anyone, and this is precisely what happened in the case of Nietzsche with the Nazis. And also a different way in the more modern era with the cult of fantastical idealism regarding the apparent infinite possibilities of the actualized human beings, which we see in the kind of New Age self-growth, self-help community, the law of attraction people. And I like the law of attraction, but some people take it too far, because they kind of take the idea of self-glorification, self-empowerment to a ridiculous degree, and they commercialize it and turn it into something like you too can be like basically the Ubermensch. That's what all these self-help gurus are basically telling you. You too could be the Ubermensch. You too could be super successful. That's really what they're saying. And so there's a greatness in this metaphor, but it can be interpreted many, many, many different ways. And that's the weakness of having a metaphorical approach. Without possessing a time machine, we cannot go back in time and show Nietzsche the many interpretations of his work to consider and then to come back with some kind of retort. So we can only speculate ourselves, really. What is very useful about the idealism of the Ubermensch is that it firmly puts the human being as center of their own existence. And this is a good thing. So long as human beings worship an external God, they are putting themselves into a subservient existence to a being who may or may not exist in the first place. I'm not knocking belief in God, but what I'm proposing is that a great many religious people completely externalize their worship of God, rather than internalizing their devotion to God. And that whether you were religious or not, Nietzsche pointed the way towards a deeper approach to religious worship is to have an internal relationship with God. Nietzsche himself was not happy with dogmatic religion, but he was open to the idea of spirituality so long as it was life-affirming. I feel that the reality of the human being is that there are not many borders to our possible expression as a species. Our civilization is largely held back according to the limiting factors in the psychological makeup of the various persons who constitute our society. In simple terms, our civilization and its possible expression as good or bad, as high or low, as boring or as metaphorically magnificent as the various minds who make up its substrate. The Ubermensch can never be actualized because there is no limit to human expression. Here I suggest the word evolution comes easier to mind, but this also has its own set of limiting beliefs attached to it. So let's go beyond this and expand our minds further. Ultimately, humanity is its own maker, and we can build an amazing society both for the group of all human beings and also for the individual. For each human being belongs to the society. It all comes down to how imaginative we are and how willing we are to take up the mantle of self-responsibility and the willingness to aspire to more. From ourselves rather than less from ourselves. We need to aspire or expect more from ourselves. Ultimately, I feel that Nietzsche was at heart an idealist, but he saw something. He was a visionary in the true sense, and he was an avant-garde thinker who was thinking way ahead of everybody else at that time. I feel that he aspired to something and also that he knew that there were not that many limiting factors when you think about it, but that once we realised our place in the universe as species, depending upon ourselves and not some external deity, the sky is the limit. What we can take from Nietzsche is the idealism and realism interwoven in implicit potentiality of every moment as a living sentient being who possesses agency, as we're all capable of doing on this earth. We must aspire to more and see where we can go as individuals and what society can become as a compendium of individual vices expressing their agency as a unit and a whole. We can and will aspire to greatness if we can but see the potentiality which Nietzsche obviously saw within the very nature of humankind.